The First Casualty by Colin Armstrong. We drew straws, I told Gerhard Weber. He looked at me intently with those anxious blue eyes of his. Vasilis held them out to us in his stubby fingers. I never thought we should do it, so I dived in first. You know, better odds. But I drew the short one anyway. Vasilis clapped me on the shoulder and pressed the pistol into my hand. I paused. Look, are you sure? Gerhard was younger than me, maybe in his early 50s, neatly cut, short grey hair and round designer glasses that were in fashion back then. Under his bottom lip was a sprout of hair. Would you call it a soul patch? Anyway, I thought he looked silly on a man of his age. Yes, I need to know everything, he insisted. I nodded. So Vasilis made the prisoner kneel on the edge of the grave that we had made him dig for himself. He had kept up a constant murmur that I thought might be a prayer. Was he religious? I thought that was a nice touch, but Gerhard just shrugged, so I went on. He seemed to sense that I was holding the gun at the back of his head, because he raised his voice to make some kind of plea. I didn't know German well, but it was something about his children and his wife. The blood was pounding in my temples. I wiped sweat from my eyes so that I could take better aim, but my hand kept shaking. You have to remember, I was only 16. I'd never shot anyone. I tried holding the pistol in both hands, but it did no good. I couldn't squeeze the trigger. Like I say, I didn't want to kill him. What happened next? Vasilis snatched the gun from me. He hit me across the face with the back of his hand and called me a coward. I pointed to the deep scar that runs across my left cheek. His signet ring left me with this memento. Then he kicked the prisoner in the back, pushing him into the grave. That was when the German decided to make a run for it. He tried to escape. Yes, he started scrambling up the far side of the pit. It had been raining, and he kept sliding back in the mud. Vasilis just laughed at him, watching him struggling in the muck. When he finally managed to pull himself out of the hole and stood on the lip, Vasilis shot him in the leg and he tumbled back in. He was in terrible pain, but he was very determined and tried to crawl out again, so Vasilis shot him in the other leg, then the back, and finally I pointed to my temple. It was over. I was elaborating, of course. Munitions were in short supply. We couldn't afford to waste 4 bullets on one prisoner. Vasilis had shot him in the back of the head and then pushed the spade into my hand and ordered me to fill in the grave while the others jeered at me for my cowardice. I can still recall the smell of cordite and newly dug soil, the wind rustling in the leaves, the humiliating feeling of shame because I'd bottled out of the execution. I got the scar years later from a bad-tempered sheep that didn't like to be sheared. Gerhard jotted something into his notebook. A tear smudged the ink. I took the opportunity to top up the wine glass. It would be best if he wasn't thinking too clearly. Where can I find other witnesses? He asked. Oh, long gone. I shrugged. But you said that most of your partisans were local farm lads, brought up in the hills. Vasilis had recruited them because they knew the forests and hunted game. There must still be some of them about. Herr Weber, you must understand. We didn't just fight the Wehrmacht. There were also the Italians and the Bulgarians. Then we Greeks began to fight one another. The communists killed the conservatives fought the liberals. The British kept sending us arms so long as we shot communists as well as Germans. Then there were German reprisals and the Great Famine. I slammed my glass down. My own grandmother starved to death. I rose from the table and looked out of the kitchen window. And after the war, do you think anyone cared about our little valley? The young men left for the cities, found jobs in the new factories and holiday resorts. Some emigrated to America, Australia, and yes, Herr Weber, even to Germany. Perhaps you might find your witnesses among the Gastarbeiter back in Wolfsburg. I was quite pleased with my little speech, and thought I struck a noble pose, staring at the horizon and stroking my moustache. Gerhard was suitably chastened. Forgive me, Dimitri, I didn't mean to offend you. You can't imagine how overwhelming this has been for me to discover from old military records that my own father died on active service in the very valley where I'd bought a holiday home, and then finding you a witness to his execution. Active service, that was a laugh. The soldier we shot that night had been drunk as a skunk. We'd snatched him when he staggered out of a brothel. I had no idea if he was Gerhard's long-lost papa or not. It was 50 years ago, for Christ's sake. Gerhard had approached me after making inquiries in the village about former members of the partisans. When he had stuck the dog-eared photo under my nose, what I had recognised was an opportunity. not the German soldier we had executed. The only other witness that I know of is Vasilis, I said. Gerhard nodded. He refuses to talk to me. He spat on the ground when I approached him. Vasilis, as charmless as ever. How I hated the man. Not just for humiliating me that night, a frightened boy ordered to murder a prisoner in cold blood, but also because later he'd unfairly denounced my father as a collaborator, organised a lynch mob to string him up in the village square. I decided it was time to make my pitch. I reached into the kitchen cabinet and pulled out an object wrapped in cloth. This is for you, I said, placing it on the table. Gerhard unwrapped it and sat back in surprise. It was a Walther P-38, the standard issue sidearm of the Wehrmacht. I took it from the prisoner last night, I said. Gerhard, it's your father's gun. I'd actually bought it in Athens the previous week from a dealer in military memorabilia. The gun was in working condition and came with a small number of live rounds. Gerhard picked it up like it was a holy relic. But this is incredible. I hoped he didn't mean that literally. I kept it as a souvenir after the war, I suppose. But now I've heard your moving story, I feel more like a caretaker than an owner. Gerhard, you're destined to be the rightful owner. Oh, you're very kind, but an item like this must be worth a lot of money to a collector. I did think of selling it last year. Money's been short lately. A dealer offered me 3,000 drachma, but I couldn't take your money, Gerhard. This figure was actually 3 times more than I'd paid for it. Dimitri, I'm a wealthy man. I insist you must have the true value of the gun. If you don't want to keep the money, then please feel free to donate it to your favorite charity. So saying, Gerhard began to construct a very satisfying pair of banknotes on my kitchen table. I felt pretty pleased with myself as I watched his taillights of his Mercedes disappear down the farm track towards the village. I'd made a tidy profit on the sale of the gun, and in exchange Gerhard had a colourful story and a fine souvenir to illustrate his family history. Wasn't everyone a winner? But the smile was wiped off my face a couple of weeks later, when a blue and white police Land Rover bumped its way up the track. Captain Mikalakis accepted a black coffee and a bowl of olives, and took the same seat that Gerhard had occupied at my kitchen table. He had a reputation for being effective and tenacious, but he must have been pretty frustrated investigating the drunken brawls and sheep stealing that passed for serious crime in our little backwater. He was in his early 30s, clean shaven, and always wore a smart suit like a city detective. Do you recognise this? He asked, placing the evidence bag containing the gun on the table. I thought Weber must have rumbled my con and gone whining to the police. It's an old gun. I saw many during the war. How about 3 weeks ago in Athens, in a shop called Military Collectibles? The police had obviously traced the gun to the shop using the serial number. I had given a false name to the proprietor and paid in cash, but he must have given them a description. People always remember the scar on my cheek. I sighed. Look, if Weber's unhappy with the gun, I'll give him his money back. There's no need to waste police time, is there? Who's Weber? The man I sold the gun to. Aren't you here because he's made a complaint? Tell me about this Weber. So I told my story to Mikalakis while he drank his coffee and chewed his olives, depositing the pits in a neat row around his saucer. All the time I was wondering why the police weren't interviewing me if Weber hadn't called them in. When Mikalakis asked me where I'd been around midnight on Saturday, I really began to worry. What had Weber done? I laughed. I was in bed, Captain. We farmers have to get up early, you know. Do you have any witnesses? No. My wife passed away 3 years ago. What's this all about? I believe you know Vasilis Fotakis. In fact, I've been told that you held him responsible for your father's death during the war. Captain, many things happened during the war that we would prefer to forget. I mean no disrespect, but you are a young man. Yes, he interrupted. But you see, Fotakis was murdered on Saturday night, shot in each leg, the back and the head. We found this gun in a refuse bin around the corner. I'm waiting for a forensic report, but I think this is the murder weapon. What's more, a witness saw a man with a scar like yours on his face running away from the scene. He told me he would check out my story about Weber, and asked me to come to the police station and make a formal statement. Of course, Gerhard Weber had an alibi. He'd returned to Germany a week before the murder. He confirmed to Mikolakis that he owned a holly home locally, but he claimed that he had no interest in family history or to have met either me or Vasilis. He denied all knowledge of the gun. I'm an old man now, too old to run a hill farm. Here in prison, I've got a roof over my head, plenty of food to eat, and medicine for my heart condition. In the world outside, the government is in crisis, and the demonstrators are demanding something called Grexit. People can't withdraw their money from the bank. The pensions have been cut, and the health service is in a mess. So maybe I didn't draw the short straw after all.